evening, everyone. Welcome to Pune International Center's much anticipated book discussion on Crosswinds, Nehru, Zhou, and Anglo-American competition over China. Authored by the distinguished Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary of India and India's former ambassador to China and a trustee of the Pune International Center. In his illustrious career, Mr. Gokhale has been a prominent figure in shaping India's foreign policy, particularly in its relations with China. With a deep understanding of the intricacies of diplomacy and international relations, he brings a unique perspective to the table. Crosswinds is Mr. Gokhale's latest addition to his repertoire of insightful books on China. Following his previous acclaimed books such as Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, and After Tiananmen, The Rise of China. Through meticulous research and analysis, Mr. Gokhale sheds light on the complex dynamics of the Nehru-Zhou era and the Anglo-American competition over China. Joining Mr. Gokhale in conversation is Mr. Amit Paranjape, the founder of ReliScore and a member of Pune International Center. With his keen insights and probing questions, Mr. Paranjape promises to facilitate a stimulating discussion and delves into the key themes and revelations of Crosswinds. Now, allow me to provide you with a brief overview of Pune International Center. PIC is an independent think tank, and we have 5 verticals deliberating on issues of national significance and influencing policymaking in India. These verticals are energy and environment and climate change, international relations, social innovation, technology and national innovation ecosystem, urbanization and economic reforms, and national security. We uphold the values of the Indian constitutions and the UN Charter. We organize roundtable discussions, international conferences, and book discussions to foster open dialogues and debates. As we embark on this intellectual journey, we anticipate an enlightening exchange of ideas and perspectives that will deepen our understanding of historical events and their implications for the present. We extend our heartfelt thanks to Mr. Gokhale and Mr. Paranjape for gracing us with their presence and sharing their expertise. Thank you all for joining us. We invite you to participate actively and ask questions at the end of the session. Together, let's engage in a vibrant and thought-provoking discussions. Thank you. Before we begin, I invite Dr. Kelkar to come and release the book once.
Thank you, Dr. Kelkar, and good afternoon to everyone. This is going to be a very interesting discussion because I'm a big fan of Vijay's books, and I have read all 3, the previous ones and this one. And this one is particularly interesting because it's looking at a very interesting area of our history, or global history, that is not that well known. Actually, even the earlier ones, there's a lot of new stuff, but this is particularly interesting. So let me start by asking about how you got into writing this particular book. Your earlier 3 books were specifically about India and China, or about Tiananmen, or how China grew after Tiananmen. But this particular book is looking at an interesting area which involves the US, involves UK, involves, of course, China and India, and other world powers, and the interesting relationships between them and the negotiations between them. So how did you get into this particular book?
Yeah, Amit, 2 questions used to intrigue me a lot, and I actually never got a satisfactory answer through my entire career in public service. One was, why did we recognize the People's Republic of China so quickly after it was established on the 1st of October 1949? It took us less than 3 months to convey our official recognition to that government, after first declaring the ambassador of the previous government, who was resident in Delhi, as persona non grata, which means that we don't recognize that ambassador. So we actually expelled the ambassador of the Republic of China and recognized this. What was the reason for it? There was no clear explanation to me. But the second question that bothered me was, despite the fact that the United States had supported our struggle for freedom, even going to the extent of telling the British during the Second World War to give India freedom because they needed independent India to support them against the fascists. And despite the United States being our largest economic benefactor post-independence, why was it that we didn't evolve a strategic relationship with the United States? So really, my research started with these two questions in mind, and since I had not been terribly successful in answering either when I was in the service, I felt that maybe I should look for papers now as to which might answer or satisfy my own curiosity. And as I went into research, it did satisfy my curiosity, but I was very surprised at what I found in the archives. And I also realized how much of information is out there which we don't know about, but which can be very easily found in both digitized format as well as if you go to the National Archives of various countries.
So we'll get into the research methodology first, but maybe I'm jumping a little bit ahead. But the first impression you get as you start reading the book, and you don't have to go beyond the first or second chapter, is were we too naive in just after our independence, or was Britain too smart as they were for 200 years before, and they used us against the United States?
Yeah, so a number of misconceptions, at least I had, were cleared. Firstly, the presumption that in the 1950s Indian foreign policy was made with the United States or the free world on one end and the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc on the other. In fact, the research shows that where it came to relations with China, the Cold War was not involved at all. It was rather the competition between the two principal Western allies which influenced the way we made policy. So, in a sense, the first myth that I thought was sort of exploded was that somehow our China policy was connected to the Cold War, which it wasn't. Yeah. The second myth that sort of got dispelled over time was the presumption that that our relationship with China was built upon both sides having the same objectives post 1945. But as I went into research, I realized there were fundamental differences in the way in which India and China looked at each other after the Second World War. Essentially, we have to give credit to Prime Minister Nehru and to the government of India that they realized that if India was to play a role after the Second World War was over, when we became independent, we should not attach ourselves to the United States or to the Soviet Union, and we couldn't do it alone. We were a relatively weak country. Our economy was not great and neither was our military capability, so we needed partners. And the obvious partners were China and Indonesia, because these were the other two independent states, the rest of it being colonies, right? So that was a strategic vision. But China did not see it the same way, and we were perhaps naive in assuming that China was also looking for partners. When I went into the archives, it was very clear from 1939 and certainly from 1943, when China was included as a great power by the Americans, that they felt that they were the dominant power in Asia and that they should shape the post-Asian order, and that other countries including India had a role to play, but a subsidiary role to play. And that sentiment became stronger when they were made a permanent member of the Security Council in 1945. So you had China, which said India holds a subordinate position in an Asian order, and you had India, which said China is an equal partner in building an Asian order. So the misconception or myth that somehow both countries were on the same wavelength and something went wrong later was also, to my mind, that myth was also exploded during the course of research.
Right, but I think this is one part that I think you have also discussed in your earlier book. But the new thing, the new realization that I had after reading this book, which I wasn't aware of, was, again, as I said, Britain's influence on us post-47. And I mean, here is United States that's desperately reaching out to us. And here's Britain for their commercial interests, essentially misleading us into having a completely different China policy. That was an interesting piece that I think I didn't know about it, and I suspect many people who haven't read your book won't understand that.
Yeah, so one of the very interesting things that came out of the research was how much the British government influenced independent India's foreign policy in the first 10 years after our independence. To the extent that they made every effort to ensure that any attempt by the Americans to convince us about China was immediately nullified. Now, what was interesting was that at the end of the Second World War, the Americans were the dominant power, and they wanted to ensure that they had an anchor in the Pacific, and that anchor was China. But the problem was that the British had a different interest in China. They wanted to preserve their trading interests and colonies, not really to fight communism and to fight the Soviet Union. And therefore, this competition that happened was what was the trigger for bringing India onto their side, because India's view mattered at that stage. India had a high stature, Nehru had a high stature in the world, and therefore what India said mattered. As a result, the British government engaged in all sorts of tactics, including deception, to bring India on their side. And I give a number of factual instances in the book. You had an instance where the Americans gave a piece of paper to the government of India on the 10th of October 1949, saying that even if you wish to recognize China, there's nothing we can do about it, we don't like the idea, but at least confirm that the Chinese will abide by understandings and agreements that have been reached by previous governments with you. What was interesting and this was eminently sensible advice, yet the government of India simply brushed this advice aside. And I discovered in our National Archives files in which a series of Indian diplomats wrote that why should we listen to the American, literally, why should we listen to the American advice? If we raise the issue of the boundary, we are causing, expressing our own doubts, and therefore we are reopening an issue which is settled, so let's keep quiet about it. Which I thought in hindsight was naive, because you are just assuming that the other country will agree to whatever line you have drawn. But there were, then again, when after Prime Minister Nehru returned from Washington, where both President Truman and Secretary Acheson were basically very unhappy because Nehru it was like a wall, he just didn't want to hear anything. Subsequent to that, the American ambassador in Delhi once again approached Vallabhbhai Patel, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, and who had been cautioning Prime Minister Nehru not to make haste. He did not say don't recognize China. He said, of course we have to recognize at some point, but must we do it so early? So he cautioned, Rajagopalachari cautioned, Sir Girja Shankar Bajpai, who was the Secretary General of the Foreign Office, also cautioned, and I've given all the actual documents and so on. But again, the British intervened and shared a secret paper that had been discussed by them in Singapore, in which they had refuted each point the Americans had made and handed it to the government of India, and we just simply used it to justify the case for China. Finally, what was very concerning to me was even after Deputy Prime Minister Vallabhbhai Patel wrote to Prime Minister Nehru on the 6th of December 1949, saying bring this matter to the notice of the cabinet. I found no evidence in any paper that the matter was ever brought to the cabinet. There is a one-line note, simply, it's a press note saying the Prime Minister informed the cabinet on the 29th of December 1949 that we are recognizing China on the following day. So it does not indicate to me that there was any discussion in the cabinet on this either. And that, in a sense, was it sort of indicated how narrowly policy was being made and how clear warning signs, both domestically and by other countries, were not being heeded in the way they should have.
Right, and I mean, absolutely. Now, I mean, if we look back now, it's clear that we were in a haste to recognize China, and US was clearly advising us the other way, and a lot of people inside of India. So, do you think this happened because of the British influence, or was it because the first Prime Minister Nehru also had some specific ideas about what he would wanted to do and what he thought he would get by recognizing China so early?
So I think it was a combination of both, Amit, because the Prime Minister had a certain strategic vision. It was a long-term vision, and in a sense, it was a good vision. But I think his expectation from China was misplaced. He had visited China in 1939. He was not able to meet Mao Zedong, but he met a number of communist leaders. He presumed that in 1950, after they had taken power, he was still basing his assumptions on what he had heard and seen in 1939. But of course, the communists had literally fought their way to power, and they were a different set of people. So I think that was one assumption that went wrong. The second was we made policy on China without a single meeting between the leaders of the two countries, and that struck me. We, for instance, discussed the whole issue of Tibet, where we had rights. We discussed the question of recognition. We helped the Chinese in Korea, and we were helping the Chinese in Indo-China. But not once had any Indian leader met a Chinese leader face to face, or vice versa. So that's why I write in my book, a lot of initial policy was made on untested assumptions rather than on any face-to-face dialogue with leaders. And I think there too, there were missteps that happened as a result.
Let me digress a little bit. You have talked a lot about specific correspondences, specific references, the National Archives. Clearly, you have spent a lot of time researching this book and have found some very interesting treasure trove of documents, many of whom which were not probably researched before. So, how did you go about finding these, and do we have them in the archives here in India, or you looked at archives outside in UK or in US as well?
Yeah, so I looked at archives in the UK, the US, and in India. The US archives, mostly State Department archives, are extremely well digitized. Very well digitized. It's very easy to get information from the US State Department archives until 1996. Subsequent to 1996, they're still, I think, under the Official Secrets Act. But for the period 1945 to 1962, there was no problem accessing American archives. A number of private universities have their own archives, particularly the Wilson Center, which has a digital archive. So I didn't even have to go there. But Stanford University has the Hoover Institution, where I did some work and where also there are excellent archives, but unfortunately not digitized. So America was quite easy. Britain has some archives which are digitized, but fortunately all the information I needed was digitized. And it is, the British archives are absolutely fabulous because they function like the government of India. You have a notes, I mean, anybody who's worked in the government of India, Dr. Kelkar, Mr. Ranade, etc., will know there's a notes portion where all the civil servants and ministers write, and then there's a correspondence portion of letters. So for somebody like me, it was very easy to find that information and to understand what was being said. And the British administrators and politicians, Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, wrote beautifully, the handwriting was superb, and the ideas were clear. So it was very easy to see how the British thought and did things, and how they thought about India. The most difficult job was the Indian archives. Frankly, the Nehru Memorial, or what is now called the Prime Minister's Memorial, has some excellent documents, some of which I stumbled on purely by chance. There was one particular reference to Gagan Vihari Lal Mehta. Now, the only reason I knew Gagan Vihari Lal Mehta was because when me and my brother and sister were growing up in Mumbai, Gagan Vihari Lal Mehta lived in the same building on the floor above us. And he was a minor celebrity, but none of us knew why Gagan Vihari Lal Mehta was a celebrity. But I was just curious about the name, and I found amazing documents. Mr. Gagan Vihari Lal Mehta's papers are entirely deposited in the Nehru Memorial. And they were a treasure trove of information. His views on, particularly when he was ambassador, 52 to 56, which covered the Taiwan Strait crisis. The discussions between Krishna Menon and John Foster Dulles, Krishna Menon and President Eisenhower, in great detail he has covered. So that was a remarkable set of documents. There were others like Appapant, also all the papers, I mean he's from Pune, all lodged in the Nehru Memorial. So that was very good. The National Archives was the most difficult. So the entire file on the recognition of India, of China by India, and this I would consider a seminal event, is under the title China Miscellaneous in the National Archives. And I stumbled on it just by chance because one of the research people I had requested to go and look for the papers actually was told by the National Archives, the file on recognition is with somebody else, you can't get it, but you can see these 2 or 3 other files. And actually those were the files on recognition. I don't know what that other poor person was looking at. He certainly didn't have any papers. So there were many documents, however, which they just claimed were missing, or which they couldn't find, or which were with somebody. So it was very disorganized. But I think I found most of the papers relating to that.
I guess we don't have access to any of the Chinese records on this, but any indirect views on what they would have written or they talked about it, or we absolutely, that's a complete dark wall.
No, surprisingly, it isn't. So the Wilson Center, for instance, which has a Cold War history project in case people are interested in that kind, the Russian archives have been declassified, right? And the Russian archives contain conversations between the Russian leaders and the Chinese leaders, many of which in my period, that is 45 to 62, dealt with India. In fact, there's a remarkable document, and this is all public domain. You type Wilson Center Center Digital Archives, it comes on the computer, and actually it's very well organized. Right? There's one document where a verbatim document of the conversation between Khrushchev and Mao Zedong on India in 1958, at which Khrushchev, 1959, at which Khrushchev tells Mao, you made a terrible mistake by criticizing India after the Dalai Lama fled, when it was your fault, you should not have let him leave. And Mao says, you know, instead of supporting a fellow communist country, you are supporting an imperialist, and you know, you are an imperialist. And they actually exchanged very harsh words. I mean, for those in the audience who presume that diplomacy is all about nice language, you should know that it's not. I mean, those of us who have practiced diplomacy know it's not. But this is a revealing document that even at a leadership level between two so-called communist friends, written, so-called communist friends, it was extremely harsh language, sometimes bordering on the very rude.
Another piece of the archives that you talked about, I mean, we talk about the disagreements between Sardar Patel and Prime Minister Nehru. But on this specific issue of China and recognizing China, did you find specific correspondence of them going back and forth on this issue?
I found the letters that Prime Minister Patel had written to the Deputy Prime Minister Vallabhbhai Patel to Prime Minister Nehru, but I also found an American archive where the American ambassador is reporting to his government of a conversation that he had with Patel, but he is reporting this after the recognition, and he is telling his government, Patel told me that it is only because of the British government that Nehru has recognized the Chinese. The British government has misled him, and particularly Sir Ralph Stevenson, who was the British ambassador in China, and the foreign secretary of the time, Ernest Bevin. So they have misled. So I found it revealing that, you know, the Deputy Prime Minister was sharing this confidence with the American ambassador who had reported it. In a sense, it corroborated my understanding that Patel and Nehru had a very clear difference on China, and that Patel felt frustrated that Nehru was not listening enough to contrarian voices.
As I said, I think this was one big learning for me, that, you know, how much Britain had influenced us. And I mean, if it was not for Britain, maybe we would have gone some other way, or at least the US way, or at least somewhere in the middle. And after 47, the extent to which Britain was able to influence us for at least a decade, or probably even more, is quite revealing. I think we thought that they left in 47 and that was the end of it. And I guess clearly it wasn't. Now, the major part of your book, or the second half of your book, essentially talks about the two Taiwan crisis, the first one and the second one, and we want to get into that. There's a lot to cover there as well, and of course we are going to have a lot of time for question and answer. So please keep your questions ready. I already have a couple of questions, including one from Professor Apte. I'm glad he came. Otherwise, he had given me his question. But before we go there, I think we can't go too far in the conversation of this book without talking about. And many adjectives has been attributed to him. I won't use any of them right now. You yourself in your book have many, some good ones, some not so good ones. I'm talking about Krishna Menon and the role that he played, or the role sometimes he thought he played, sometimes the role he really played, sometimes the way he was used by different powers for their personal gains. Sometimes he may have helped India, sometimes he definitely hurt India's interests. But before we get to him, there's an interesting extract, 2 lines that I want to definitely read from your book, and then we'll get to him. So this extract, just give me a minute, sorry. So, so here's what this person says. So Krishna Menon is a menace and a bore. He is a bore because he conceives himself to be intellectually superior and rather coyly pretends to cover this under a cloak of excessive humility and modesty. He is at He is a menace because a master of twisting words and meanings of others and is governed by an ambition to prove himself the master international manipulator and politician of the age. I'll just stop here. If someone has read the book, then I'm not going to ask this question. But if someone has not read the book, it's an open question. Can you guess who wrote this? No, I'll let Vijay answer who wrote it and talk briefly about this person.
So this was written in the private diary of President Dwight Eisenhower of the United States after his meetings with Krishna Menon. And I think that he was absolutely spot on. Because if you read the supporting material that I got from the archives, and this is mainly our own archives, but even the British archives, you realize how personalities can make a difference in foreign policy, both in a positive way and in a negative way. We sometimes assume that it's the system which works, individuals don't matter, but individuals make a big difference where diplomacy is concerned, whether it was John Foster Dulles of the United States, Anthony Eden of Britain, or Krishna Menon in India. There's no doubt that Krishna Menon was a brilliant man, and he certainly had a lot of political affinity with the first Prime Minister of India, and the first Prime Minister of India also trusted him. But he was a person who was very self-centered and always wanted to put himself at the center of things and insisted on becoming a mediator. But a mediator in general is somebody who is unbiased and really has no strong views about either party. Then you are an effective mediator. In this case, Krishna Menon was strongly biased in favor of China, strongly biased against the United States, but he actually still felt that he could be a mediator. And he continued to try to get the Americans to accept this, even though each time he talked to the Americans, he actually continued, he offended them more and more. So you have instances during the first Taiwan Strait crisis where he tells the Americans, and he literally said this to Dulles, and these are from the American archives. He tells Dulles and Eisenhower that I am actually helping you because China can grab those islands and you will be embarrassed. Now, for India to tell this to the world's superpower,
Someone has used the word delusional about him.
Yeah, delusional. Well, I use the word delusion. I use the word delusional, but I thought, I could well imagine what the Americans would think about this. There was another instance where the Americans, 13 American prisoners of war are being held by the Chinese. Their pilots were overflying China on secret missions in 1953, shot down by the Chinese and captured. And Krishna Menon tells Dulles, why don't you, this is a minor matter, he says, and why don't you let Americans travel to the United States? And Eisenhower actually lost his, to China, and Eisenhower actually lost his temper with Krishna Menon. And Dulles later on says, it's like asking me to send another child to the kidnappers of my baby. I mean, literally, these are Dulles' words. That you are asking me to send another of my children to the kidnapper of my own baby. So there was a deep antipathy to Krishna Menon, and that was unfortunate because over time the Americans associated Krishna Menon with India. Even though a lot of Indian leaders, particularly people like Morarji Desai or Govind Vallabh Pant, had good relations with the United States, where Mr. Morarji Desai went as finance minister, and if you see the State Department archives, they really liked Morarji Desai and they wanted to help India economically. But because they assumed Krishna Menon was Nehru's acolyte, and therefore Krishna Menon was voicing Nehru's views, their attitude toward India became so negative that by the second Taiwan Strait crisis, 1958, they just told the British and the Russians, we don't want India anywhere, and telegrams go out from the State Department to American ambassadors across the world saying, don't involve India at all, which was sad because we were a democracy and we did matter in the world, and really this was a reflection of how personalities mishandled that relationship.
I think we'll come back to Krishna Menon because this is one common strand over the next 3-4 chapters. But I think let's probably go chronologically and then come back to some of the interesting incidents about him. So the second chapter of your book basically talks about the Indo-China crisis of 1954. So can you briefly talk about that, and then that leading further to the second crisis as well?
Yeah. So the Indo-China crisis basically happened because the French rule dramatically collapsed in April 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And the fear was that the communists would take over Vietnam, and the Americans actually thought then a domino effect would occur and that India would fall after Thailand had been overtaken, because Thailand had a border with Indochina, and then India would be the next domino to fall. And because the communists were active in India, this was the American presumption that India was a likely target for Soviet expansion into Asia. So for the Americans, it was vital to stop communism before it engulfed all of Indochina, particularly southern Vietnam. And that's how the Indo-China crisis began. Now, again, we have to credit Prime Minister Nehru for the vision that he understood any conflict in Indochina would have a bad effect on India. It wouldn't be good for India to have a conflict so close to home. So his strategic intention was that we must try and have a solution to this matter. And therefore, that's how India began to intervene in the Indo-China crisis. The British were very happy because the British had the same objective. If there was a war in Indochina, British colonies in Malaya, Borneo, Hong Kong were all threatened. And they didn't want that. They had big trading interests, and of course they owned Hong Kong, and they had trading interests all over Southeast Asia. So Britain and India, actually their positions converged. But again, I show how the British manipulated India against the United States, putting us in the front line to give the United States the appearance that it was India which was leading the charge against the United States in Indochina, and we as Britain had to go along because we were part of the Commonwealth, and if Nehru took a position, we would be embarrassed. So it was perhaps the best example of how the British manipulated the government of India to convince the United States that India was ill-intentioned, and the Americans bought it because there was very little dialogue between the Indians and the Americans at that point of time. A number of things had happened by then. India had refused to join the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. They had refused to sign the peace treaty with Japan, insisting that they would do a separate one which actually recognized Japan. They had already begun to make noises against the Americans in Taiwan and in the Middle East. And therefore, there was a great deal of suspicion. And once the British started putting all this in the American minds, it only reinforced that suspicion. So, as the Indo-China crisis developed, what happened was two things. One is our coordination with the British became closer and closer, and our gulf with the United States became wider and wider. And eventually, when we tried to tell the Americans that we would mediate, the Americans were very skeptical, and they did not allow us to really be effective. At that stage, we could have been, because our relations with China were still good. But because of the way we had taken the anti-American position, the Americans just didn't back us on that.
And I think, we talk about diplomacy, and when we, as students, try to learn from experts like you about diplomacy and about the fact that, there are only, as is widely said, there are only permanent interests, no permanent friends, and that we can be friends with, talking about present situation, we can be friends with Russia and the West at the same time, where both sides look at us saying, how can you do that? But we say we are fine. Now, here's a great example of Britain doing that, right? They desperately needed the Americans in the Atlantic, and as far as NATO or Europe was concerned. But they were ready to confront them aggressively here, but that too they did it very smartly by firing on our shoulder.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
But they were able to manage those interests. Whether they succeeded or not is a different story. Actually, they failed, but I think that's how they were going about it at that time. And we failed because we were taken for a ride to satisfy their interests. Now let's come forward to the first Taiwan crisis. But before we get there, I think it will be useful if you can provide a quick 2-minute or a 5-minute overview of how, going back to 49, how Taiwan has entered, because many in India, I figure, still don't understand how Taiwan actually started and how it got created in 49, or how did the two nations theory, as we talk about today, actually came about. And then what happened in 54 consequently, and the geography of that area with the two islands. And because that's also very important in present day when we talk about the South China Sea.
Yeah, yeah. No, so basically the Taiwan issue is one where Taiwan is an island or a group of islands about 100 nautical miles off the coast of China, which had been occupied by the Japanese Empire until 1945. Under the Cairo Declaration, which was made by the victors, it was decided that as and when the Second World War is over, Taiwan will be returned to China, which at that time was the nationalist China, the China ruled by President Chiang Kai-shek. But of course, after the Second World War, the Americans continued to occupy Taiwan, and I guess the procedure to return Taiwan to China was underway. The revolution happened, and the communists established government in October 1949. Ironically, the Americans might have parted with Taiwan had it not been for the Korean War of 1950. The moment the Chinese confronted the Americans on the 38th parallel in Korea, Taiwan became the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Americans, and they were determined that Taiwan will never go back to the People's Republic of China. That is the real origin of the Taiwan Strait crisis, as it is called, and that is the position that is there today. The Americans effectively have built an island chain to hem the Chinese in: Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, and the South Pacific Islands, which acts as an almost continuous chain from the northeast to the southwest, which hems the Chinese from breaking out into the Pacific. So Taiwan is a very key strategic thing. In this book, however, the point I make, which many Indians don't know, is that we actually took a very proactive role in the Taiwan Straits crisis. And that is because Prime Minister Nehru differentiated between two things. The question of sovereignty, who Taiwan belongs to, he was very clear. It belongs to China, it's none of our business. But does the peace and stability of the region get affected? And if that happens, does it affect us? His answer was yes, it does. And if that is the case, it is not just China's business, it is our business as well. So he differentiated between the sovereignty issue and the peace and security issue. And he said where peace and security is involved, India must play a role. If you ask the average citizen of India today, they will tell you that we recognized Taiwan in 1949 and had nothing further to do with it. But in fact, the book's basic contention is we had a lot to do with both crises that occurred, 54, 55 and 58. We played a very proactive role. Our objectives were very clear. We wanted to reduce tension. We did not want to see conflict. And we went about trying to secure that objective. Of course, we didn't succeed because individuals, I think, mishandled the situation, Krishna Menon in particular. But the objective was sound, and the relevance is that today we are back to the 1950s. In fact, my last chapter deals with this. Why is the book relevant? I mean, history is otherwise should not be relevant. But it's relevant because we are actually back to the 1950s. You have the two major powers in the world, China and the United States, each confronting the other. And Taiwan is an existential problem for both. It's an existential problem for China because it is intolerable to them that 75 years after the so-called liberation, and when they are assuming they are a great power, a tiny island 100 nautical miles of their coast is not under their control. I mean, it affects image. And for the Americans, it's an existential problem because it's a democracy. Taiwan is a democracy. And if the Chinese extinguish democracy there, then that's the end of America's reputation as the defender of the free world, apart from the fact that the island chain collapses. Any one of those islands falls into Chinese hands, the Chinese break into the Pacific. So it's an existential problem for both. And therefore, it is very relevant today to know what happened in the 1950s if India is to navigate what is almost certainly going to be another Taiwan Straits crisis in the next 10 years.
Two crises you have gotten into a lot of details, and that was a lot of new learning for me, and it would be for most because that's some part that we never really study in most other books. But it was interesting to know that after the Korean War, this was probably the next immediate instance where the world stood very close to the next nuclear war. I mean, America. I think you talk about some of the correspondence where through the chain, I think they were getting ready to load nuclear weapons at some point of time, right?
Exactly. In fact, I've actually given the exact source, which is a meeting of the National Security Council chaired by President Eisenhower, at which he gives instructions that to prepare tactical nuclear weapons against China. The British get wind of it, and the British are very worried. It is at this point that Britain brings India into that whole matter. Until then, the British are not interested in having India come in on the Taiwan issue. But the moment they get a sense the Americans may use nuclear weapons, they bring India into the issue. So it played that played a very pivotal role in India being brought in by the British.
Right. Before we get to the last chapter, and we're going to leave a lot of times for question and answers. So have your questions ready. I'm going to come back to Krishna Menon, because in the second Taiwan crisis, while the Americans hated him, he was very effectively used without him even realizing by Zhou, by the Chinese. Can you talk about that incident?
Yeah, so that actually this is a very good example of how individuals can matter negatively or positively in the foreign policy of even big countries like India. Essentially, in the second Taiwan Straits crisis, Prime Minister Nehru's own inclination was not to interfere. And he, in fact, went off on a long trip to Bhutan. He was supposed to go to Tibet, but the Chinese, by then, relations were not good. And they denied him a chance to go to Tibet. So he instead went to Bhutan. It took him a month. He was not inclined to intervene. But Krishna Menon wanted to make a role for himself. And therefore, the way that it was done was the Chinese summoned our ambassador in Peking, in what was then Peking, which is now Beijing, in the middle of the night. And said, I have a message for you to deliver to Krishna Menon, a letter to Krishna Menon, and that letter should, in that letter it said India should take a role. Now, what surprised me was the Chinese are the most protocol conscious country in the world. And yet, look at Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister, he is not writing to the Prime Minister of India saying intervene. He is not writing to the Foreign Minister of India saying intervene. He is writing to the Defense Minister of India and saying, you interfere in this on my behalf. He did this because he had had long conversations with Krishna Menon in 1954, and he knew that Krishna Menon was very vulnerable to flattery and very vulnerable to feeling important, and he encouraged that. So this was a clear case where the Chinese, in complete violation of protocol, actually wrote to Krishna Menon, and Krishna Menon fell hook, line and sinker. The result that happened was, I say this in the book, there was a period in October 1958 where India followed two completely different foreign policies with one hand not knowing what the other was doing. So you had our ambassador in Beijing, the foreign secretary, Mr. G. Parthasarathi was ambassador in Beijing, the foreign secretary was Bimal Dutt, our ambassador in Washington, all saying the situation is grave, but it is not something where we should intervene. And on the other hand, you have Krishna Menon saying the situation, we are about to have a nuclear war, let's intervene. And Krishna Menon, all on his own, goes on to intervene in this crisis. Even when the External Affairs Ministry's considered opinion is not to intervene in the crisis. And he does this, Krishna Menon, without consulting Nehru, who is not reachable because he's...
what made matters worse that time was because Nehru was incommunicado. I guess he was, which is unthinkable today.
Exactly.
But back then, I guess it was not, it was possible.
Yeah, but the fact that he was doing this without keeping anybody else informed, including the official part of the government of India, let alone the political part of it, was very disturbing because, if we all go off tangentially like this in terms of national security, where are we going to take the state? And this is a classic example of how he did this with no authority, either political or diplomatic. In fact, in the Indo-China crisis, I mentioned an interview he subsequently gives to a journalist in which he expresses with delight that neither Nehru nor the foreign ministry knew what I was doing. They only came to know when I told them what I was doing, and I told them only what they needed to know. So it's very disturbing when, high officials of the government withhold information from official organs of the government. So,
I'm digressing a little bit, but I'm surprised a film hasn't been made about Krishna Menon. It will be an interesting film about...
Well, you have now two versions, right? Because Mr. Jairam Ramesh he has written a brilliant biography on Krishna Menon, but it's a bit on the positive side. I've written one which is more negative. I must admit he was very decent in allowing me to use his photographs and to use some of his research, because he had done a lot of research and he was very open in sharing some of it with me. But they are two very contrasting portrayals of Krishna Menon.
So let's come to the last chapter of your book, and then we'll go to question and answers. So the epilogue is an important chapter because, I mean, you briefly mentioned some time back that there are so many lessons. I mean, history, whether it's 50 years old or 500 years old, things never change, and there's always something that we can learn from it. So what is it that we can learn from what happened in the 50s with India, China, and the two Taiwan crises for today?
Yeah. Well, first, I mean, a couple of general comments I want to make. One is, I think we have to revisit the whole issue of how non-aligned we actually were in the 1950s. We often talk of non-alignment and that, at the moment we are not non-aligned, we are getting aligned, we are, it's endangering India's national security. But actually, as the book shows, we were completely aligned with the British against the Americans. And this had nothing to do with the Cold War, frankly. I mean, it was we were aligning ourselves with one Western country against another Western country, and this is just one example of how aligned we were. So we really need to do a lot of study on whether we really were non-aligned at any point of time in our history before we judge how the current government acts, for instance, in aligning with the United States or anybody else. So I think that's the first lesson. I think the second one was really, if you look at the material in the book, there is a lack of system building that took place. I can understand that in 1949 we were newly independent, there was no system of consultation. But by 1958, we had been independent for 15 years. There should have been a wider system of consultation of the cabinet, consultation within the government of India, a consultation with Parliament. But none of this had evolved even until 1958. And therefore, systems of process-driven foreign policy was in fact substituted by personal diplomacy. And as a result, perhaps information that leaders should have got, which might have influenced policy, was not received by them. And I think that is a very important thing we need to draw from this book, that if you don't consult widely, then you are likely to fail because you're working within a very narrow element. The third thing is, of course, the relevance of this book is if another crisis happens in the Taiwan Strait, and I would think that in the next 10 to 12 years it will happen in the Taiwan Strait. I think that Nehru's vision is important, which is, as far as sovereignty is concerned, don't concern yourself. That's a matter that China has to deal with, and it can deal with it however it likes by fighting the US or not. But if peace and stability of the region get affected, it has to be India's business, simply because we are extremely vulnerable economically. And I don't write this in the book, but I've given references to another paper I've done, where I've said basically that if we imagine we are going to remain isolated from a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, we should think again. 50% of Indian shipping passes through the Malacca Strait and the Taiwan Strait. So straight away, any exports that you make, that part of the economy will be affected if there is a blockade or worse in the Taiwan Strait. Secondly, most of the supply chains, separate from America, most of the supply chains come from China, Korea, Japan for us, right? So any blockade in the Taiwan Straits means all supplies will stop. And that includes to critical export performing industries, right? Pharma, auto, telecom, which we also export. So that will have a knock-on effect on industry. If semiconductors stop, and all the semiconductors are generally made there, your services industry will collapse, and that's 50% of your economy. So right from, this is literally e-commerce, e-logistics, distance education, entertainment, gaming. Even ordering a pizza from Domino, it will collapse you because everything is on the mobile app. And lastly, submarine cables. Now, we've had two examples in the last year where submarine cables have been cut. The Houthis damaged a submarine cable just now, and in last March, the Chinese supposedly, quote unquote, accidentally cut a submarine cable. But 15 of our cables, all of which carry information, IT information from Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, and everywhere else to Silicon Valley, are anchored off Taiwan. If the Chinese cut the cables, that's the end of our IT-enabled services industry. My prediction is that if we don't take this seriously, we are potentially going to have an economic disaster on our hands. The world is going to have an economic disaster, and planning has to begin now. Every ministry of the government of India has to say where they are vulnerable, where China is concerned, and what they need to do. And this is not just finance, commerce, education, because all our education is now internet based. How will it affect even ministries like culture, for instance? Every ministry across the board has somehow got deeply been, China is deeply entrenched in terms of supplies, materials, machinery, and so on. We have to look at our vulnerabilities, and that's a long-term exercise.
I think that's the India-China. I mean, India's vulnerabilities to China. I mean, beyond Taiwan, at a broader level, I think is a big discussion and concern as well. And coming back to Taiwan, I think it's not just India. I think what we don't realize, and I think again, it's the Americans who probably didn't look at this as seriously when they were, as you have described in your earlier book, how they were drinking the Kool-Aid of Chinese about great market and cheap supplies, and till 2008-9, and they let China become so big. But another thing they did at the same time in that period, which they are realizing now, is the crazy amount of dependence not just United States but the entire world has on Taiwan. I mean, pretty much more 90% of the semiconductors, of the high-end semiconductors, all the NVIDIA chips, pretty much all the chips that go into your Apple phone are manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan. So, and right now we don't have an alternate plant.
Yeah.
US, Japan are trying to build them. TSMC is building them there, but we still don't have those. So that itself is such a big dependence that the world has that they didn't have 15, 20 years back today. But I think, so a very fascinating book, and I strongly urge all of you to get it and read it. Going to get to question and answers. We have about 25 minutes for that. And please keep your question as short as possible so that we can get a long answer from Vijay. And I'm going to start with Professor Apte, since he had asked me this question yesterday itself. Do we have a mic, or can you take it to Professor Apte, please?
My question was concerning the kind of tension which existed right from 1952 between Soviet Union and China, and we obviously had a domestic Communist Party repercussions of this. So, is this period in any way reflected in your researches? This aspect of our involvement with both of them. Both of them had the same ideological tinge or posture, but they had very different divergent views right from 1952. It only became apparent in 1958 onwards, to the extent that it ultimately resulted into split into the Communist Party.
Yeah, no, you are absolutely right, Professor Apte, and this is not part of the book, but it's a very important part of our diplomatic history, which we ought to recognize, that there was actually no point at which the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were in sync. We all thought they were in sync. But one of the documents that are uncovered actually, which I didn't use in the book eventually, was that perhaps the first country to predict that there would be a Sino-Soviet split was India. And it was none other than Prime Minister Nehru who told President Eisenhower, and that's how because I saw conversations between Nehru and Eisenhower, that you are making a mistake if you think that China and the Soviet Union are on the same plane. The Chinese are not communists, they are nationalists, and they will protect themselves. So, yeah, this is very important, and perhaps we should have realized that. But I think also the reason that Nehru encouraged President Bulganin and General Secretary Khrushchev to come to India in 1955 may have stemmed from this thinking. So there is some attempt, I think, by India to repair relations with the Soviet Union in the second half of the 50s, and I'm sure that is based on Nehru's understanding that there was going to be a split. But that issue is not covered in this book.
Questions?
Thank you, Ambassador Gokhale and sir, for such an amazing conversation. My name is Ritik and I'm a research analyst with the Kumaran Initiative. My question is more contemporary in nature. In your 2021 Carnegie paper, one of the factors that you mentioned was still fundamental lack of scholarship both sides have of each other, and that have shaped all the crisis up to Kalwan. Since you wrote that paper and your book since, do you think that gap has widened or has it closed? Or has, yeah, thank you.
I think we need a lot of people to write on China for that gap to close. But what I do see, I must admit, are encouraging signs in the younger generation of researchers across the board who are doing very good work on China. And part of it is because actually the think tank community has grown in the last 10 years. So you have Takshashil organization, or as you said, the Kubernetes initiative, you have ORF, you have various institutions in Pune, Bangalore, Chennai, and so on. So, and very many younger people are coming. Frankly, however, it's not enough, because why would a young person do research in China on China unless there is some remuneration at the end of it? You have to find people have to get a job. That's how the US does research. I mean, it's well funded, and people who study China make a living out of it. Ultimately, only when our the people in India fund that research will you get top class research, and that funding cannot be done by the government. It must be done by our business community. Again and again, I think we must underscore the point that if India is to grow into a $15 trillion economy, which is all our desire, it cannot be done through domestic consumption alone. It has to be export driven. For that, you need data and information on how markets abroad function, what are the rules, regulations, and the geopolitics of it, right? Therefore, companies have to fund that research because it benefits companies also, in addition to the national interest and national security. I'm hopeful that that process has begun now because you have a number of these private initiatives, but it will require a lot of work. At the moment, we are too dependent on Western sources, and they don't write keeping India's interests in mind.
Next question. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, sir. My name is Rohit. Thank you for organizing this event. So I have two questions. One is, sir, you talked a lot about the leadership and foreign policy at that around 1950s. So is there any difference that has happened in India from 1950 to the current dispensation? And sir, when we talk about China, like I just see a logical viewpoint that a US is standing at its door while nobody is near the US. So the actual fear should be US rather than China, because we have to compete with US. So how appropriate it is to fight with China, or work internally to develop ourselves and technologically, basically.
Yeah, so both are very good questions. I think so far as your first, the first question was on. No, I'm dead. There is no doubt that systems and processes have evolved over the 75 years that we have been independent. So, for instance, today you do have what the institution called the Cabinet Committee on Security. The key ministers of the government regularly meet to make an assessment of the situation. On and off the cabinet is informed. Certainly in parliament there are more foreign policy debates than were perhaps there at that time. The media is active, but most important is the citizens of India have got active thanks to this mobile phone. And any of us who worked in the foreign ministry after 2010 were at the receiving end, because you suddenly got flurries of views by Indian citizens on a whole range of issues, and you had to take cognizance of it because otherwise it would go viral. So I think there are some checks and balances now in the system. The one weakness even currently in the system is there is no interface between the academic and intellectual community and the government. That, I have to say, we have essentially failed over 75 years to build. And it is a problem now because the government has the capacity to act but no time to do research because you're firefighting all the time. Academia has the time to do deep research, but without access to information can't do research which is materially relevant to the government. And therefore, that fit has to be there. if you look at any other major power, that fit is there, one way or another. The Americans, it's the revolving door. They bring people from academia into high positions in government. In the case of China, the other end, all think tanks are funded by the state very well, so that really serious research comes out. In our case, neither happens. In fact, academia is not let anywhere near the government. So I think that's a lacuna. The second question was about the
US versus India.
No,
US versus China.
I think your point is well taken. The issue is not a debate about whether China is a problem or not. The issue is in a world which is gaining bipolarity. I mean, we can have a debate on whether the world is multilateral, multipolar or bipolar, but we cannot deny that at the moment there are bipolar features in the world, right? China and US are so dominant economically and militarily that the rest of the countries, even 5, 6, 8 put together, can't equal either of them. So if we are faced with a bipolar situation, or at least bipolarity features, then the debate is not about China and US, it is about us as a country having the capacity to manage on our own, technologically, economically and militarily. The debate therefore is not, for instance, 5G, should we use Huawei or should we use Nokia and Ericsson? Frankly, both snoop on us, and the record of the West is far worse on industrial espionage than China's. So the question is, why aren't we doing 5G, AI, quantum? Where are we on this compared to the US and to the to China? So I mean, if the underlying intent of a question was, isn't going towards the US also equally a problem? I think it is. I mean, ultimately, such a big country like us has to stand on our own feet. And I think, I mean, at least policies of the government are moving in that direction, but it's a partnership with industry. If industry does not partner the government, at the end of it all, you know, for the first 60 years we complained that the government was doing business. Now the government is out of business and building enabling frameworks. This was the great reform of Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, isn't it? Now we are saying, why is the government only an enabling framework? Why can't they now invest in semiconductors? Or why can't they invest in quantum computing? I mean, we can't have it both ways.
Good evening, sir. My name is Saraswati. I am a patent analyst in CSIR. So my question is regarding language. Now Mandarin Chinese is one of the difficult language, and it is like comparatively difficult to learn. And I have seen my friends that we have a very passive approach toward Chinese language or towards Chinese culture also. Like when I say that my sister or me, I have tried to learn Chinese, or my sister is learning Chinese, they say why Chinese? And so how can we promote this Chinese education, or how can we change this approach toward Chinese studies? Because we will need to change our approach if we want to progress. Because China is we can change our friends, but we cannot change our neighbors. And second question is related to AI, that in the age of AI, most of the things are translated from Chinese to English. Being patent analyst, I know how vague translation it is. So, do you feel that diplomats or defense personnel can rely on that translation part?
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Okay, first of all, let me tell you that diplomats and defense personnel actually have been learning the Chinese language for at least 4 decades. So certainly in the foreign ministry, our intelligence services, army, I don't know about Air Force and Navy, I didn't have too much contact, there is a certain fluency in the language. The problem is the wider population. It doesn't really think that learning Chinese is important. This aspect is disturbing to me, the culture bit particularly that you mentioned, because when the History Literature Festival was in Pune, it was organized by Chinmay Tumbe, who works in Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and I asked him, I said, do you do the case, I mean, I am not MBA ignorant, so I asked him, do you do case study method in IIM Ahmedabad, sir? And he said, yes, we only do case studies. Which case studies do you do? US companies. So I said, how many Chinese companies do you case study of? 0. And I told him, I said, Chinmay, are you telling me in an $18 trillion economy, there's not one successful case study? that tells us that even the premier institution of India, we are not studying the way China does business, then I think there is something seriously wrong in our country. Right. So I think learning about Chinese culture is absolutely vital to understand China, and the language as well. That being said, of course, fortunately for us, these various AI tools are going to make translations easier and easier. So everybody doesn't need to learn Chinese, but yeah, you need core competence, and I think the bigger companies, some of the other institutions of governance, you need to build a competence in Chinese. I mean, even a person even better than to me to talk about this is Mr. Ranade, who has dealt with China. At least Chinese, we have some competence. Do you know that in the Tibetan language, I would not be able to find two people who can speak in this country today, and at one stage Pune University was a leading institution for the study of Tibetan language. The same is true of Pali, for instance. Now these are languages we need to know if we want to understand China, but there's virtually no Indian who speaks Tibetan in the way where you can pick up information, intelligence and so on. So yeah, we have a problem there.
The Chinese language, as you said, I mean, government can't do everything. I mean, industry also has to. And as you said, industry can learn. I mean, if they're $18 trillion economy, clearly they have got so many things right.
Exactly.
So just for that, they should be learning about their companies, right? Next question, please. Here, he's been.
Hi, sir. So my question is about the border issue with China. That is the biggest aspect of our relationship with China, right? So we find that this border is ungoverned. There have been multiple treaties since the colonial times which are defining the border now. I sometimes wonder, is India benefiting from an undefined border more than China is perhaps? Considering that, maybe, can we see in the near future, would there be any attempts from our side to define the border through a commission? Or would this be an unresolved issue which would maybe benefit us more than it benefits the Chinese side?
So India has made more than one attempt to try and resolve the border. I think both Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit and Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's visit, both actually resulted in an Indian initiative to try and resolve the border on a political basis. And I think at least my own assumption, of course people can differ in their views, was that the Chinese were not interested in settling the border. They only wanted to pacify the border region because their priority was economic development, but they really had no stake in settling the border. Now, we have to also assume that they had no stake because they had got so used to a rising growth rate and leaving India behind, that they just assumed this line would continue to grow in that same fashion, in a linear fashion, and we would fall further and further behind. Now, I think there's a rethink in China. At least I hope there's a rethink in China, because post 2019 things have changed a bit. First of all, their own linear growth rate has problems in it. Secondly, to their great surprise, I suspect we haven't come out of COVID too badly, and we seem to be doing fairly okay. Right? I mean, we could do better, but we are doing much better than many, right? I think there may be some kind of thinking in the longer term that they may have to come to terms with us. But in the short term, let's say if you're talking 2030, I think they still think they have a significant advantage, and therefore we are vulnerable at this point of time. Now, in this vulnerable situation, whether or not we can make another effort at a compromise depends on whether there's a sense that the other side is willing to do it. If the other side is not willing to compromise, offering something would, in my opinion, be a mistake. I mean, we have this repeated instance. Every Prime Minister tries something with Pakistan and then nothing comes of it. So if the other side is not willing, what can you do?
So, sir, my question is that you said that we are basically back to the 1950s when it comes to Taiwan, China, and United States and India. But one thing that we all can agree is that China has grown into a major manufacturing hub since then. Yeah. So, in the view of this change, what should be India's new position, or what should be India's position when it comes to Taiwan, United States, and the border issue all combined?
Okay, well, on Taiwan, as I said, on the sovereignty issue, our position has been clear since 30th of December 1949. policy can always be changed, right? But I think any sensible government has to weigh the cost-benefit analysis of changing policy. At least I don't see any situation in which the benefit outweighs the cost. The cost we will pay to say, let's say, to recognize Taiwan or even to have a political relationship with them far outweighs any benefit we will actually derive from Taiwan, I'm saying, right? So I think we have to, but as far as peace and security is concerned, I think the government, and if you see the way the government has proceeded in the last, say, year and a half, I think there is a very clear understanding that it is our business. There are small things which give the way in which the government's thinking takes place. For the first time in probably, I don't know, 50, 60 years, after Pelosi's visit in August 2023, when the Chinese launched missiles and blockaded it, we actually made a statement. Now, a number of my own colleagues in the West, researchers, have told me, oh, but that was a non-statement. And I said to them, listen, if in 60 years we are making a statement, we are hardly going to come out from 0 to 100. But the fact that the government has made a statement is a change of policy. It's not arbitrarily done by Dr. Jaishankar or by some foreign secretary or somebody. It must have been considered very seriously within the government, right? The other thing is, if you watched yesterday or day before, where the PM inaugurated the semiconductor thing with China, he says, "Hamare jo Taiwan ke mitra hai." Now, for the Prime Minister to mention this word, which is in India was considered a cuss word for 70 years, taboo, is a phenomenally big thing. We may think nothing of it. I'm sure that there is all kinds of smoke coming out of Chinese ears in Beijing. Jaydev, do you agree with me?
Yesterday, for the first time, I mean, I don't know for what it's worth, but I actually saw a somewhat soft and positive, well, in a way, positive tweet from Global Times about India, comparing about how both of us are doing well, which was a rarity.
But that's misinformation.
Yeah. But because they mock us 99% of the time, so maybe this was just 1 out of 99 they want to sort
No,
of...
this is misinformation. Global Times, by the way, is an English language publication meant for us. No Chinese with any respectability reads that paper.
US as well.
And yes, yeah, for the outside world, English speaking world, yeah.
But actually, I have a question on this. I mean, look, if we can learn from what the way Britain used us in the 40s and 50s against China, if the Taiwan crisis now flares up, I mean, we would have our defenses and we would do some things diplomatically, but how would US use us in such a crisis?
Oh, they would like to involve us fully, but I don't think, if you look at the way also in which the US wanted to involve us in the Iraq crisis and the way in which Prime Ministers Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh sort of steered their way, I think there are enough people in the government who know that we should not get entangled. That was true even on the Russia thing. I mean, the way in which we maneuvered to ensure we didn't get entangled by either side, actually. I think we are fairly mature people who I think will take care of that. But of course, the US will try. The question also is how that sequence of events plays out. You have to presume that in Beijing, the thinking is that if the United States creates a conflict situation, then India has the capability to open a second front, if it is aligned with the US. And they may launch a preemptive action against India, either escalating forces on the border or even a preemptive strike. In that case, of course, India would have to intervene on the side of the Americans. So the contingencies are many, and I presume people are thinking and planning for it.
Okay, we have about 10 more minutes, so few quick questions. Anyone? Yeah. Here, then here. Oh, then Mr. Kotwal as well.
Good evening, sir. I'm from the Gokhale Institute and pursuing my BSc in economics right now. Speaking of our dependent supply chains, especially in the Southeast Asian region, I wanted to know how does diplomacy play, like on this specific issue of de-risking supply chains, how does diplomacy play a role in not only engaging with our business partners like the UK or the US, but with developing countries like Vietnam or even Indonesia for that matter, who are who also get a safety kind of net with de-risking supply chains of businesses.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's a very good question because actually diplomacy has become almost entirely economic diplomacy now. Barring maybe Pakistan and China, there's no such thing as political diplomacy, right? Most embassies are actually engaged in economic diplomacy, and you can do this in various ways. Apple coming to India, there is a diplomatic element to it as well, because you have to portray a certain public image of India abroad. You have also got to ensure that the supply chain comes with Apple, and of course Apple will bring the supply chain, but basically reaching out to the small vendors, the intermediate product good suppliers, through the embassy, through embassy induced delegations and so on, that helps. So I think that's one way. Secondly, the Gulf, our relationship with the Gulf has been completely transformed. That's actually one of the big achievements of the current government. And this is even with Qatar, with which we had such a dicey situation, we've resolved it, right? What was their main concern? Their main concern is twofold. Where is our money going to be safe? We can't trust the West. Suddenly they will freeze it, and we are oversaturated in China. So, in a sense, by India said you can put money here, and it'll be safe. The other is their real worry is food security. They are all deserts. Where can they get the complete chain from the growing of food to the packaging of food and to the transportation? That's a lot of where the investment from the Arabs is coming, or the Gulf is coming into India, right? That too is, there is a function of diplomacy involved there too. You're going and explaining what it is to them, hand-holding to a certain degree. So there's a lot of synergy now between the External Affairs Ministry and the key line ministries of the government to create that atmosphere, and some state governments. There are some state governments are better than others, but promotion by states like Gujarat, Telangana and Tamil Nadu are just amazing. Even in terms of embassies, the kind of outreach they make to our embassies, expect us to do things for them, it's quite phenomenal.
I have two questions. One is related to the problem we have had recently with China and the Galwan area. What do you think has China gained by that? Because the net result is we have got closer to the Americans, and that certainly does not appear to be in China's interest. That's one. The second part is, you mentioned about what are the possibilities in Taiwan. But what do you think are the scenarios? Can we ever see a scenario where Taiwan is delinked completely, permanently from China? Because, personally, as you rightly put it, sovereignty is a solved problem. Nobody disputes that.
Yeah.
So how long is this going to continue? Because I see some trends sometimes in the US that they have kind of reconciled themselves to the fact that after X years, that X could be 5, 10, whatever it is, Taiwan is going to go into the China fold completely, and the world has to adjust itself. Americans seem to sort of go in that direction by the investments they're making and the statements that are coming. There is a case where Taiwanese engineers have flown to US as part of the deal where they're setting up the semiconductor plants. So, even if we say we have to play a role in this because it is affecting us, what is the scenario that's likely to develop other than this?
No, I think, so second question, I don't think the Americans have actually sort of internalized that eventually Taiwan will go to China in the current situation. I think the United States realizes if that happens, they've lost their status as the world power. So, no, I think they will, because they understand that their whole status as a Pacific power, as the dominant Pacific power, hinges on their ensuring that the Pacific island states, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, are not bullied by China or in any way endangered by them. I think the Americans are committed quite a lot to that, and this whole idea of AUKUS, Quad, some of this may not work. AUKUS I'm not sure will work, but it is intended to, they understand they can't do it alone anymore. China is just too big. But I think they will, I think we should not assume the Americans have given up on this, even though they are weaker. But on the other thing, I in fact would answer differently, Mr. Kotwal. I think the Chinese have made a strategic mistake in Galwan. I've said this, yeah. They've made a strategic mistake. Because at the end of it all, see, what was, and I've said this many times, before 2015, anybody below the age of 35 in India, if you ask them about China, the answer you got was they've moved far ahead of India, we're nowhere near them, look at the Xiaomi phone. They were dazzled by China. It was a very positive image, and many of them didn't even know what the boundary conflict was. They'd heard of it, but it was irrelevant. Galwan has made every Indian below 30 conscious of the threat part, and that won't go away for that whole generation. They're all going to live till 80 or 90. So they've actually hurt themselves in the way that Pakistan did after Kargil. It created a whole generation of Indians who said Pakistan is horrible. And this is what's happened here. So one, that is I think a misstep at the public opinion level. Secondly, I think the current Prime Minister did try to make an effort to build a certain understanding. Now, there are two opinions in the room as to whether it should have been done or should not have been done, and obviously I am biased because I was part of the government, so I can't comment on that. But what I can say is, I don't think he's going to do it again, because a certain trust that leaders establish, when that trust goes, it is virtually impossible to restore that trust. It has to be some exceptional gesture on the other side. And he is not helping. I mean, even a small thing, by he I mean President Xi, we don't have a Chinese ambassador in Delhi for 19 or 20 months now. What is he trying to tell us? Because whether there's an ambassador or not makes no difference to us. But if he wants to establish trust, this is the easiest way to do it. Not having an ambassador is not establishing trust. So I think on many levels, it's a misstep. Now, they are just a bigger power. So like the Americans, you can make mistakes and possibly even get away with it. But, it goes into the thinking of Indian public opinion. And so ultimately, public opinion is the strength of any government. And we are a democracy. So I think, in a sense, he's helped the government of India to rally Indians behind him, behind the government. And I think he's done, Mr. Xi Jinping has done what he's been trying to do.
In a way, he lost India, at least for a generation or for...
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah. So this is going to be the last question. I think we are all out of time.
I had just two questions. One was about you are researching the various archival papers of China, Russia, etc. So, were they in English, or you had learned the language and you had to do it? That was the first question. And the second one, you said, of course, the British had a lot of influence on our foreign policy for a long time. So, was it at their instance, or was it that we wanted their help and we thought that they are the experts who can guide us, and maybe Nehru and company, they wanted to consult them all the time to know what should be done, etc.
Yeah, on the research thing, of course, the Chinese don't open their archives at all. There are some documents in Chinese, and because I've studied Chinese, courtesy the government of India, not courtesy myself, so I can read those documents. But a lot have been translated into English in the American private universities. And those are digital and many are open sources. So you could get them, and they are so authentic Chinese documents, usually leaked through the Russian archives or through others. So it's not difficult, but I do agree that we are limited in our research because Chinese archives are virtually closed. So that's a problem. The second question was, no. So I think we have to conclude from the book that the first generation of the Indian leadership was very much aligned with the British, simply because we had been used to their way of governing, and because there were personal relations between the Indian political leaders and the British leaders, whether it was Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, or their foreign secretaries. And that helped. We spoke the same language, we shared the same universities.
Studied at the same...
universities, yeah. Whereas with the Americans, there was but the other thing is, I found a distinct ideological element where the Americans were concerned. We had somehow decided that they were, anti-communist and therefore insensitive to nationalism, which had taken on a communist color in parts of Asia and Africa, and that they were not helping the decolonization process, and therefore, they were wanting to have all kinds of alliances to fight the Soviet Union, fight China and so on, which wasn't aligned with our policy. And that, I think, also vitiated relations with the US.
I think this can go on for a long time, but I think we have a time constraint, so I'm going to stop here. I'm going to ask, as my privilege of being the moderator, I'm going to ask my last question, and that is, all the books that you have written have been extremely helpful and enlightening for especially someone like me to learn about this subject. So I'm most curious about your next book. If you can give us a sneak preview.
Well, I thought I would write about the period from 2010 to 2022, which is the period of Xi Jinping. And I sort of went through about 70% of the book and then I just stopped. Because I really don't know whether if I write anything, it will look foolish after another year. I might continue that book, but actually I'm actually starting to work on another project, which I think again is which is a history related thing, but which has contemporary relevance. And that is, I don't know how many of you have heard of the Stillwell Road. This is a road that the British and the Americans built between 1942 and 1945, which connected the northeastern part of India with the southern part of China. It's the only road which connects India to China proper. Everything else goes through Tibet, and Tibet, apart from the very high altitudes, has no population. This is, and all the gap between the northeast of India and China is only 100 kilometers of Burmese territory, Myanmar territory. If you bridge that, then you have direct connection between India and China into the heartland of China. This road was of course built by the Americans because they needed to supply the Chinese army fighting the Japanese. But I want to go into how this evolved, what the American view was, what the British thought about this, and also what then the American view of India was at that time. And whether it dovetailed with the British or not. So I want to do a book which of course is on the Stillwell Road, and I think the road has a potential in the future to eventually be the connector, and we have seen many roads being built which thought would never happen across the world, right? But also because it's important again to the reason I did this was because Stillwell's records are actually at Stanford University, and I was there researching on this book, but I stumbled on those papers. He has some amazing things to say about India, which are at complete variance with the British in 1942 and 43, which reinforced the view in this book that the Americans genuinely wanted India to get independence and that they saw the British as obstructing it. So I wanted to bring that aspect out as well. So I mean, it's a sort of, at the initial stages, I'm sort of gathering the material which is all over the world, including in the British archives. Unfortunately, that is not digitized. So I don't know how I'm going to do it. I might have to go to London.
I think that will be a very interesting read. Just one suggestion. I think it will be great if you write a little bit about the 19th century as well. There's a lot written about it, 19th century China and the Indian, the David Sassoons and the Opium Wars and India's influence. And there's a lot written, but I think it will be interesting from an expert like you to get that perspective, because that's another part of the history that most Indians don't understand very well. My knowledge is also very limited on that. And that probably still affects China's psyche today as far as India is concerned today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a huge subject, yes.
So something to think about. Yeah. With that, I think I'm going to conclude this. This was an excellent session. This can go on for another hour or so. I have these kind of discussions with Vijay, and it's always very, very enlightening. We do hope that he writes this next book soon, next 6 months. So we have this session again. But once again, I would like to thank him a lot for the book and for this conversation. And thank you, Pune International Center.
Thank you.
So this has been a truly fascinating discussion, like all the previous discussions that we've had with Mr. Vijay Gokhale. And at the outset, I want to request Mr. Amit Paranjape to present Mr. Gokhale with the books from Pune International Center. So PIC has also authored a book on China, Rising to the China Challenge. And the subtitle is very interesting, Winning Through Strategic Patience and Economic Growth. The other book is India's Pathways to Success, Winning in the Next Decade, as we approach 100 years of independence. So this has been so fascinating because when it comes to China, there is such a deep fog of half-truths, misinformation and lack of information. And we know many of the reasons that came out in this discussion. And there were so many interesting points that were brought out. why did we quickly recognize communist China, the British influence on Indian foreign policy in the first 10 years, uh, and the influence of personalities in shaping our foreign policy, the Taiwan Straits crisis, uh, and this point that there has not been so much of discussion in India over China as is required. And as has been our habit for almost anything and everything, we have been blaming Pakistan. And in this context, one of PIC's trustees, General Shami Mehta, once remarked that we Indians should forget Pakistan and think of China every day and twice on Sunday. So about crosswinds, uh, Professor C. Raja Mohan, the well-known scholar and columnist on international affairs, has said that Crosswinds presents deep insights into New Delhi's troubled approach to Beijing and a valuable template to reflect on the future of India-China ties amidst renewed turbulence in the relations between the great powers. So I think it presents a great link for all of us to study China and those of us who are interested in China. So just to mention, this book is available outside, and we have Mr. Gokhale here to autograph the book. Yeah, and one last point, we have Mr. Jaidev Ranade with us today, and some time back we had a discussion on Mr. Gokhale's book on Tiananmen Square, and both Mr. Gokhale and Mr. Ranade were in China when Tiananmen Square happened, and that was a very interesting discussion also. So finally, I wish to thank Team PIC, Geeta Hosmane, and all our young research scholars and interns uh, who have helped us put this program together. And not to forget Mr. Amit Paranjape for beautifully moderating this discussion, and to all of you for your participation and questions. Thank you very much.